In late 2025, the United States crossed a terrifying threshold. The national debt surged past $38 trillion. The final $1 trillion was added in just 82 days, the fastest accumulation of debt in history outside of the pandemic. You're told this is a distant problem, a number so large it's meaningless. You're told politicians will handle it. That is a carefully constructed lie. Right now, the government is spending more on interest payments for this debt than on the entire national defense budget. This isn't a future crisis. It's a clear and present drain on your wealth, happening today. But the real story isn't the number itself. It's what they plan to do about it. And it doesn't involve paying it back. There is a silent default underway, a deliberate plan to erase this staggering sum. And the price will be paid from your bank account. This wasn't a sudden accident. It was a slow, deliberate march off a cliff we were told didn't exist. Just a few years ago, in 2016, a presidential candidate stood on stage and promised to pay down the national debt entirely, within 8 years. It was a bold promise that voters from all sides wanted to believe. But behind the curtain, a different machine was already running. The debt didn't go down. It exploded. Why? The easy answer is to blame a single party or a single president. But the data tells a different story. The real culprit is a quiet agreement in Washington, a political engine I call the bipartisan blank check. For decades, both parties have treated the nation's credit card like an infinite resource. After 9/11, it paid for wars. In 2008, it paid for bank bailouts. Then came tax cuts, followed by trillions in pandemic stimulus. Each decision, sold as a necessary solution to a crisis, added another layer of concrete to our balance sheet. For years, this seemed manageable. Interest rates were near zero. Borrowing was cheap. But then came the bill. We crossed a terrifying line, not when the debt hit a specific number, but when the cost of that debt spiraled out of control. Today, the United States government spends more on interest payments for its past borrowing than it does on its entire national defense budget. Think about that. All the soldiers, aircraft carriers, and advanced technology in the U.S. military cost less than the fee for our national credit card. This is the moment the problem stopped being theoretical. It's the moment the debt became a living, breathing creature that must be fed before anything else. Before soldiers, before roads, before you, and that creature is getting hungrier. So the government had to find a new way to feed it, a silent way to make its payments without you ever seeing a line item on your tax return. This isn't just a number on a screen. It's a silent withdrawal from your life savings, a hidden mechanism I call the devaluation drain. You don't see it on a tax form, but it's hitting your bank account every single day. Right now, the U.S. government spends more money on interest payments than on the entire national defense budget. The cost to service our existing debt is higher than the cost to fund our military. The scale is staggering. The total debt is now equal to the entire economic output of the United States for a full year. This isn't an abstract theory. It's a direct transfer of wealth. Every dollar in your retirement account, your emergency fund, your checking account, is a drop in a leaking bucket, and the leak is getting faster. A government watchdog warns the debt will soon grow faster than the economy itself. The drain is accelerating. So if there's no official default notice in the mail, how is this financial sleight of hand actually being performed? This machine wasn't built overnight. For decades, a simple promise anchored the system. Every dollar was backed by gold, but in 1971, that promise was broken. The dollar was untethered, and the age of limitless spending began. It took the nation over 200 years to accumulate its first $1 trillion in debt. Now, we add that amount in a matter of months. This wasn't a partisan failure. It was a bipartisan project. The engine for this is a devastatingly simple process. I call the Treasury two-step. First, Congress spends more money than it collects in taxes, creating a deficit. Second, to cover that gap, the Treasury issues bonds, government IOUs. Then, the Federal Reserve steps in. It creates new dollars out of thin air to buy those bonds. Spending becomes debt, and debt becomes new money. A perfect, self-fueling cycle that allows politicians to make promises they can't afford. For years, this seemed like a free lunch. But the bill has arrived. The total debt now rivals the size of the entire U.S. economy. Every product made, every service rendered in a full year wouldn't be enough to pay it off. Worse, the interest payments alone now cost more than the entire national defense budget. We spend more servicing our past than we do protecting our future. So how do you manage a debt that's bigger than your economy when you can't tax or cut your way out? You don't default with a bang. You default with a whisper. You start erasing the debt and the wealth of everyone who holds it through a hidden mechanism designed to be invisible. So how does this silent default actually work? It's not a single decision. It's a machine, a process designed to be so complex, so boring, that you'll look away. I call it the fiscal siphon. Imagine the entire U.S. economy is a giant swimming pool. Every dollar you've ever saved, earned, or invested is a drop of water in that pool. The total amount of water represents the nation's wealth. Here's how the siphon starts, in 3 quiet steps. First, the government needs cash it doesn't have. It's spending more on just the interest on its debt than it does on the entire national defense budget. So, the Treasury Department prints up a flood of IOUs, which we call bonds. Second, they try to sell these bonds. But there's a problem. There aren't enough legitimate buyers in the world for this mountain of new debt. Why would there be? The country's total debt is already equal to its entire economic output for a year. It's a terrible investment. So who buys the rest? This is the third step, the secret handshake. The Federal Reserve, America's central bank, steps in. With a few keystrokes, it creates billions of new dollars from nothing. It then uses this newly created money to buy the government's bonds that nobody else wanted. The government gets its cash. The bills get paid. The crisis is averted. But what happened to the swimming pool? The Fed just opened a fire hose and flooded the pool with trillions of new, artificial dollars. Your drops of water are still there, but the pool is now overflowing. Your savings, your wealth, have been diluted. Each dollar is now a smaller fraction of the total. It buys less, it is worth less. This is the siphon. They aren't taking dollars out of your account. They are pumping new ones into the system, draining the value from yours. It's not a theory. It's just math. And the proof is hidden in plain sight. Let's look at the numbers. To see how this machine claims its first victims, you don't have to look at a struggling family. You have to look at the most powerful organization on earth, the United States military. For generations, the Department of Defense has been the undisputed king of the federal budget. Its funding is a statement of priorities, a projection of power that shapes global events. The United States spends more on its military than the next 9 countries combined, accounting for nearly 40% of all defense expenditures on the planet. Nothing else even comes close. Until now. In a shift that went almost unnoticed by the public, a new line item has quietly eclipsed the defense budget. It's not a secret weapons program, it's not a new government agency, it's the interest payment on the national debt. This is the first clear casualty of the silent default. I call it the debt draft. It's a mandatory, non-negotiable conscription of hundreds of billions of your tax dollars, siphoned away before they can ever be used for anything else. For the first time in modern history, America is now spending more to service its past borrowing than to fund its active military. Think about what that means. Every dollar you pay in taxes now goes to interest first. The needs of the present, from national security to infrastructure, get whatever is left over. The world's most formidable fighting force has been financially outmaneuvered, not by a foreign rival, but by its own government's balance sheet. It was defeated without a single shot being fired. This wasn't a budget cut passed by Congress. It was an automatic consequence, a mathematical certainty. The bleeding of national wealth had become so severe that it began to starve the very institutions meant to protect the nation. The silent default had claimed its first and largest victim. But this was just the beginning. To understand how this works, you have to stop thinking about the government's budget like your own. You have 2 options: earn more or spend less. The government has a third, hidden option, a trapdoor. It starts with a simple, undeniable fact. The government spends vastly more money than it collects in taxes. This gap, the deficit, has to be filled. So the Treasury Department issues bonds. Think of these as formal IOUs sold to investors, other countries, and major banks. It's a promise to pay the money back later with interest. For a long time this worked, but what happens when the IOUs become so large and the interest payments so crushing that there aren't enough willing buyers? What happens when the interest on the debt costs more than the entire national defense budget? That's where the trapdoor opens. This is the part that's designed to be confusing. I call it the liquidity loophole. When the Treasury can't find enough buyers for its debt in the open market, the central bank steps in. It doesn't use tax money. It doesn't have a savings account. It creates new money digitally from nothing. With this new money, it buys the government's IOUs. This is the critical step. It's a closed loop. The government spends money it doesn't have. The Treasury issues debt to cover it. The central bank prints money to buy that debt. No new wealth was created. No new products were made. The total amount of stuff in the economy is the same, but the number of dollars chasing it has just increased. Imagine you're in a tiny boat with a slow leak. You have a bucket to bail out the water. But instead of throwing the water overboard, you just pour it back into the other end of the boat. You're busy, you feel like you're doing something, but the boat is still sinking. This is why most people miss it. It doesn't appear on your tax return. It's not debated on the evening news. The language is deliberately opaque. Quantitative easing, balance sheet expansion. It's a magic trick happening in plain sight, disguised as boring monetary policy. While we argue about tax hikes or spending cuts measured in billions, this machine is quietly creating trillions in the background, diluting the value of every dollar you have ever saved. So how much is this dilution actually costing you? This isn't a vague feeling, it's a number. We can calculate the exact rate of decay on your wealth. And when you run the math, you see the true price of this silent default. The damage didn't stop at the Pentagon's doorstep. That was just the first tremor. The real earthquake was happening deep inside the nation's balance sheet. A quiet, mathematical certainty was taking hold. I call it the interest trap. For the first time in modern history, a horrifying line was crossed. The U.S. government began spending more money on interest payments for its existing debt than on its entire national defense. Think about that. All the soldiers, sailors, aircraft carriers, and advanced technology combined now cost less than the fee for America's past borrowing. The country was no longer investing primarily in its protection. It was paying the service charge on its own credit card. This is the second stage of the cascade. The first victim was a specific sector. The second is the entire federal budget. The system has turned inward, consuming itself. Watchdog groups had warned for years that the debt would soon grow faster than the economy itself, but the warnings were treated as background noise. The lesson was never learned. The machine wasn't designed to learn. It was designed to spend. This creates a terrifying feedback loop, a kind of servitude spiral. To pay the massive interest bill, the Treasury must borrow even more money. That new borrowing then generates its own interest payments, making next year's bill even larger. The government stops being a shareholder in the country's future and becomes a tenant, paying ever-increasing rent on its own past decisions. The budget is no longer a tool for building roads or funding research. It is an engine dedicated to feeding the ghosts of yesterday's spending. But a spiral like this cannot feed on itself forever. Eventually, it must find a new source of energy. It must expand beyond government ledgers and find fresh capital to consume. The cascade doesn't stop here. It accelerates. And here's where it gets personal. The abstract numbers on a screen feel distant, so let's make them concrete. Let's do the cold, hard math. Right now, the interest payments on the national debt cost more than the entire budget for national defense. Think about what that means. The cost to maintain the world's most powerful military, every soldier's salary, every aircraft carrier, every satellite in orbit, is now less than the fee we pay for past spending. The mechanism I call the interest overrun. Your tax dollars are no longer primarily building the future. They are servicing the past. More money is flowing to foreign governments and institutional bondholders than to the foundational security of the nation. That's just the annual cost. Look at the total. The federal debt is now roughly equal to the entire U.S. economy. This isn't just a statistic. It's a gravitational field. I call it the one-to-one drag. Imagine your personal debt matched your entire yearly income. Every dollar you earn is already spoken for by a dollar you owe. You can't move, you can't invest, you can't build. You are simply treading water, and the current is pulling you under. That is the mathematical reality for the country right now. So why not just cut spending? Because the math shows that's a trap. Economists have run the numbers. A fiscal contraction equivalent to just 5% of GDP, a cut that sounds responsible, wouldn't balance the books. It would reverse modest growth and trigger a 3% economic shrinkage. This is the austerity boomerang. Cutting spending removes money from the economy, which shrinks tax revenues, making the debt-to-GDP ratio even worse. the cure becomes the poison. The calculations show a system locked in a death spiral. Growth can't outrun the debt. The interest payments are suffocating the budget. And any attempt to cut spending only accelerates the collapse. The math is a cage with no exit. So if every logical path leads to ruin, what do the illogical ones look like? Now there is a powerful, optimistic argument against everything you've just heard. The skeptics will tell you that we can simply grow our way out of this crisis. They'll point to history, claiming that a booming economy will shrink the debt relative to our national wealth. To them, this isn't a death spiral. It's a temporary problem that innovation and productivity will solve. They argue that panic is the real enemy, and that America's economic engine is powerful enough to outrun its obligations. And in a different era, they might have been right. But that optimistic case collides with a brutal mathematical reality. According to watchdog groups, the debt is on track to grow faster than the U.S. economy itself. Think about that. The problem is now outpacing the solution. We are no longer in a race we can win by just running faster. The finish line is moving away from us. This creates a terrifying feedback loop I call the contraction catch-22. The other solution they propose is simple: cut spending. But the numbers show this is no longer a simple fix. Recent analysis warns that a fiscal contraction of just 5% of GDP, a level of cuts needed to make a real dent, could trigger a 3% shrinkage of the entire economy. The medicine would kill the patient. Cutting spending deeply enough to matter would likely cause a recession, which in turn would reduce tax revenues and make the debt problem even worse. The nuance, of course, is that some combination of growth and fiscal discipline is the only theoretical way out. It's not an impossible path. It's just one we have shown no ability or willingness to walk. But even if they were right, so where does this road lead? The models show two primary destinations, and you don't get to vote on which one we reach. Scenario A is the slow, grinding decay. Let's call it the Great Stagnation. In this future, the debt continues to grow just slightly faster than the economy itself, just as watchdog groups now warn. It's not a crash. It's a quiet squeeze. Your paycheck might not go down, but it buys less milk, less gas, less of a future, year after year. The government avoids a dramatic default by simply devaluing the debt and your savings along with it. This is the high probability path, the one we are currently on. It's the path of a managed decline, designed to be so gradual you barely notice the theft. Scenario B is the shock event, the sovereign shockwave. This is the crisis JP Morgan's CEO Jamie Dimon warns is almost inevitable. A foreign nation, a major creditor, decides to sell its U.S. bonds. Suddenly, the world questions the value of American debt. Interest rates spike. The math becomes brutal. A fiscal contraction of just 5% of GDP could ignite a 3% economic shrinkage, turning a recession into a depression overnight. The probability of this scenario increases every single day we continue on the first path. It's not a question of if, but of what the final trigger will be. Of course, there is a powerful argument that both scenarios are just fantasy. The skeptics will tell you the system is simply too big, too central to the global economy, to ever truly fail. But hold on. Isn't the cure worse than the disease? The most intelligent objection to this entire argument isn't denial, it's pragmatism. It says that any attempt to fix this with sudden, massive budget cuts would trigger an immediate and devastating recession. Slashing spending would vaporize jobs, cripple businesses, and plunge millions into poverty. The argument is that a managed, high-debt economy is infinitely better than the brutal chaos of forced austerity. And they have a point. The numbers back them up. A fiscal contraction equivalent to just 5% of GDP could flip modest growth into a 3% economic shrinkage. That isn't a correction. It's a collapse, a self-inflicted wound. But this argument misses the terrifying reality of the situation. It assumes we still have a choice. It frames this as a debate between two policy options, when the math is now in control. The market is about to make the choice for us. I call it the austerity ambush. We are no longer deciding if we cut, but how the cuts will be forced upon us, through a planned, painful restructuring or through a chaotic market revolt that makes any plan impossible. A currency crisis, a bond market freeze. This is no longer a political debate between two economic theories. It's a mathematical countdown. And that forces me to look at this not as a commentator, but as someone who simply has to navigate the world that comes next. So what am I doing with my own money? First, the necessary disclaimer. I am not a financial advisor, and this is not a recommendation to buy or sell anything. This is simply a look into my personal framework for navigating what I see coming. My approach is about survival first and profit second. My core strategy is built on carefully managed position sizing. I allocate small, calculated portions of my capital to assets that I believe are insulated from this devaluation. Think of it as building a lifeboat, not a battleship. The goal is to weather the storm with minimal damage. My primary trigger for adjusting these positions is what I call the recession switch. Watchdog reports estimate that a fiscal contraction of just 5% of GDP could trigger a 3% economic shrinkage. If I see policy moving aggressively in that direction, I will shift my allocation more defensively. It's a simple, data-driven tripwire. But defense is only half the battle, because inside every crisis, there's an echo of opportunity. The same forces devaluing your savings could be creating the conditions for one of the most counterintuitive, explosive asset rallies in modern history. The system isn't broken. It's a machine designed to perform a slow-motion heist on your savings, a silent transfer of wealth that never appears on a tax form. This isn't a distant forecast. As Jamie Dimon warned, the tectonic plates are shifting right now. A fiscal watchdog confirms the debt is set to grow faster than the entire U.S. economy, the financial equivalent of accelerating towards a cliff. But knowing the diagnosis is not the cure. The most important question isn't what's happening, but what you can do about it. Our next investigation will break down the exact assets being used as a financial shield against this coming storm, and the one asset class being quietly accumulated by central banks themselves. The default isn't announced on television. It's tallied in the quiet erosion of your future.